evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Julia Villamines, your librarian this term. Before we start, I just want to run through how this event will work. There will be audience questions towards the end. You may submit questions at any time using the question and answer function. Please only use this function. If you raise your hand or send me a message, I won't see it. These questions will be asked towards the end of the interview, and please make sure to include your name and college when you ask to be credited. With that, Cecile Richards is a national leader for women's rights and social and economic justice and a co-founder of Supermajority, a new organization fighting for gender equity. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Make Trouble. As president of Planned Parenthood Federation of America and Planned Parenthood Action Fund for 12 years, Richards worked to increase affordable access to reproductive health care and to build a healthier and safer world for women and young people. After starting her career as a labor organizer, working with women earning the minimum wage, she went on to start her own grassroots organizations and later served as Deputy Chief of Staff to House Democratic leader Nancy Pelosi. Cecile, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure, Julia, nice to be with you.
Let's start with your time at Planned Parenthood. You were president of the organization for 12 years. What do you consider to be your biggest achievement during that time?
So I assume folks know, but I'm not sure. You know, Planned Parenthood is an organization that provides healthcare, reproductive healthcare and education, and also advocates for those services in the US. It's actually more than 100 years old, so it's a long-time institution. And so there are a lot of things we did in that time, but I suppose the thing that was most important to me was expanding access to reproductive care and birth control in particular under the Affordable Care Act. We had this opportunity when President Obama was elected to really rethink the way healthcare was accessible in the US. And there are so many things there that, I mean, things that are probably unthinkable for you all in Britain, but it was the first time we actually could get rid of gender rating because historically insurance companies had charged women more for health insurance. It was also a chance to cover women's preventive care. It was the first time insurance companies had to cover maternity benefits. But one of the biggest fights we had was over birth control. And so I'll never forget one day after, battling this for many, many months, I got a call from then President Obama, which was very exciting at Planned Parenthood. And he was calling to tell me that he was about to announce at the White House that from now on, all people would get birth control covered at no cost in their insurance plans. And that, that's where, even as a healthcare provider to about 2.5 million people every year, that decision, that policy just radically changed access overnight. And in fact, it's part of the reason we now have a record low rate of teenage pregnancy in the US, and also I think 30-year low of unintended pregnancy. So it was something that even beyond the patients that Planned Parenthood saw was something that was able to really change access and the kinds of birth control that women could get, which again, I know this sounds, since our healthcare system is so different than yours, but for us in the US, this was revolutionary.
Yes, so you say that for the US, this is revolutionary, and it's true for, in the UK, we have the NHS, we get birth control for free. Why do you think birth control is a political issue specifically in the US?
It is so nonsensical. And, it's, of course, we had to fight. We won't go back through the entire history, but there was a fight to even make birth control legal, much less covered by insurance plans. It wasn't until the Supreme Court decision in Griswold that married couples could get birth control legally. And of course, that after Griswold, many people, women had to lie and put a ring on their finger to go to the doctor to say that they needed birth control. I mean, it's been a long, hard fought battle. And I remember when I first came to Planned Parenthood, insurance companies, many of them didn't even cover birth control. In fact, some pharmacists refused to even fill birth control prescriptions. So it is a politicized issue. I mean, dating back, century ago, and it's been a hard fought battle, but it's one of the things that is really hard to understand. I wish I could explain it to you rationally. Birth control is actually the most used medical prescription in the US. Everyone loves it, not just women, guys love it, all people love it, and it's very popular. And so again, it shouldn't have taken this long because it's not even that we were fighting against something that was controversial. And I'm sorry that it took us that long. And of course, just to be honest, and now fast forward, under the Trump administration, they've actually done everything they could to make birth control less available, including a domestic gag order that has thrown a lot of health centers and clinics out of our national family planning program. So it's not that we've, of course, no victory is ever permanent. So we are continuing to have to fight, of course, with a new administration. It's my sincere hope that we get rid of the domestic gag order, and clinics and providers are able to serve their patients once again without the interference of the government.
One of the main things people think about when they think about Planned Parenthood, fairly or unfairly, is abortion. And abortion rights in the US is very, very polarized. Why do you think this issue represents some of the biggest political and in many ways like moral fissures in American society? Is it a question of religion, sexism, or is it something else?
I mean, it's probably a whole combination of things. And I think the thing that's important, and this is something that I learned definitely over my many years at Planned Parenthood, and yes, we are a provider of safe and legal abortion, which is a really important service. It's not the only service we provide, but it is something that we fight every day. And now the folks that run Planned Parenthood do fight to make sure that it is available and accessible. I think the point about abortion is people have very personal feelings about abortion, and many people have wrestled with this topic themselves, either for themselves, their families, their own pregnancies. I think the real question is it government's business? And I think the important thing is and I do respect people's personal point of view on this, because I have 3 kids. I understand these are important issues that people need to be able to decide. And overwhelmingly, people in the United States believe this is a personal, private decision for the person who's pregnant, not for government. Unfortunately, I believe that women in particular have been sort of used, and women's issues have been used as a partisan political wedge. And this has happened for a long time, but certainly I would say dating back to really 1994 and the advent of the what we called then the religious right, the effort to engage a segment of the voting population that was highly agitated about issues of reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights. And unfortunately, I'd say since 94 in the US, the Republican Party has now really become, not representative of the United States, the general public, and has really been has veered to the right on these issues, even though if you polled the American people, between 60 and 70% believe in abortion rights. And that's so it's not controversial in that sense.
Yeah, no, I think it's really interesting that you say that it's become this partisan political wedge. And actually one of the big changes that occurred during your time as president at Planned Parenthood was the involvement in the 2008 election cycle when the organization endorsed Obama. Of course, now the list of endorsements is a lot longer, and the organization's support for the Democratic candidates is very obvious, partially because like you said, it's a partisan issue. But do you think these endorsements may actually make support for Planned Parenthood more partisan? And if it does, is this a good thing?
It's such a great question. So so one thing just to throw in is Planned Parenthood is incredibly popular, and it's because really everyone comes to Planned Parenthood. I mean, I think 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women in the country have been to Planned Parenthood, including myself. I mean, when you're uninsured, when you're a young person starting out, often college students, and then often women who don't have other access to healthcare, although we don't only serve women. And so it's actually it's sort of an American institution. And in order to be able to serve the patients that we serve, it's really important that it is that our services are available. And increasingly, and one of the reasons I actually came to Planned Parenthood is increasingly, even though we provided excellent care, really top of the line reproductive care. I mean, that's always been our specialty. Laws were being passed at the state and at the federal level that were preventing folks from getting access to care. And in fact, currently current Vice President Pence, outgoing Vice President Pence, was really one of the first members of Congress to begin to introduce legislation to defund Planned Parenthood, basically prevent public services from being provided through Planned Parenthood. And so it was very clear that if we didn't get involved as advocates and as really engaging the voting public, it was going to get increasingly hard to provide care to folks. We are 100% nonpartisan, Planned Parenthood is, and definitely endorse Republicans as well. Unfortunately, though, as I said earlier, the Republican Party, it has now become kind of a litmus test to be a Republican or a Republican in running for office at the highest levels, that you have to be against safe and legal abortion, that you have to be against Planned Parenthood. In fact, it's kind of funny, not even funny isn't the right word, but I mean, Donald Trump himself was a Planned Parenthood supporter, and then immediately switched gears when he made his run for president. The same was true with Mitt Romney, Governor Romney, who ran against, of course, President Obama, and he too had been a Planned Parenthood supporter. So unfortunately now, in order to be a success, quote unquote, in the Republican Party, you take this sort of oath to oppose reproductive health care access, even though if you polled our patients, they come from all walks of life. And so I say, like, folks who come into a Planned Parenthood Health Center aren't coming to make a political statement. They're coming because they need access to affordable reproductive care. And in a lot of parts of the country, because we don't have the kind of system that you have in Britain, in a lot of areas, in terms of affordable women's health in particular, Planned Parenthood is often the best option and sometimes the only option.
There's a lot of changes that are happening right now, like you said, in the Republican Party, but also in the country at large. And during an interview in 2018, you said you thought you were winning in the long term when it came to abortion rights. Have you had to reevaluate this belief in light of current events? I'm thinking specifically, of course, about the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court.
So, okay, well, I would separate out these two things, but I mean, actually, if you look at where the American people are on the importance of having access to safe and legal abortion and reproductive health care, we're really at our highest point since the Roe versus Wade decision, which legalized abortion in our country more than 40 years ago. In part, I believe that is due to the fact that until recently, and frankly, until Donald Trump became president, I don't think folks really thought it was at risk. And there was always a conversation about, well, what happens if the Supreme Court changes? What happens if this and that? It wasn't until Donald Trump and his opportunity to actually nominate and confirm 3 judges on the Supreme Court, a third of our Supreme Court, this has become a very front of mind issue. So I don't actually think the American people are getting more supportive of abortion rights, while the Republican Party and frankly this administration has become more intolerant. I mean, on a host of issues, but I know we're talking about this one. I mean, voting rights, LGBTQ rights, you name it. I will say the nomination and confirmation of Judge Barrett was one of the most discouraging moments, I think, in our democracy. It was, as folks probably know, it was done literally in like the last minute of this administration. People were already voting in the United States. I can't remember how many millions of people had already voted. The polls were showing that Donald Trump was not going to be reelected. And there was no precedent for jamming through a Supreme Court nominee in record time on a completely party line vote. And I mean, that is the other thing that's so discouraging. Justice Ginsburg, who Justice Barrett replaced, had been, I mean, her, when she was nominated and voted on, it was with a huge bipartisan majority. And I think that the thing that's disturbing about not only the Supreme Court, but also the federal judiciary in the US is now it is has been populated by very partisan nominees, often without the support of the American Bar Association, which is of course our highest ranking legal entity that rates judicial nominees. I think it's clear to the American people now that this third leg of our government, the judiciary that is supposed to be above and beyond partisan politics, under this president has become as partisan as any other branch of government. And I think it's for, I guess, and without belaboring this, but I do believe on issues, again, of abortion rights, access to health care, voting rights. We've seen some terrible voting rights decisions that have disenfranchised folks in America. And we could go on, that we can't rely on the judicial system, which historically was kind of like the place that people went for a more balanced, really system of justice. And that so many of these issues that the American people believe in and support, we're going to have to now legislate at both at the state level and the federal level, because I don't think we can count on the courts.
Yeah. And you mentioned the 2020 elections and voting rights specifically, and you've been doing some incredible work now with Supermajority, which you co-founded, of course. While most of our speakers are familiar with Planned Parenthood, I think the majority of them would have not heard of Supermajority. So I was wondering if you could give us an introduction of sorts to the work you've been doing and the organization has been doing.
Sure, I would love to. And I'm glad to even hear that folks have heard of Planned Parenthood. That's good. I mean, it is an international, global movement, but that's good to hear. Well, I just would, I'll go back to 2016, which I'm sure folks can remember, was a shock to the entire system and body politic in the US, where Hillary Clinton received 3 million more votes than Donald Trump, but he became the president because of our completely antiquated electoral college system, which we could get into if folks want to talk about. And I think a lot of people were surprised, had expected Hillary Clinton to become the first woman president. And after that election, people just sort of came out of the woodwork in terms of organizing. And I was still at Planned Parenthood at the time. We had to immediately get organized to defend both the Affordable Care Act and access to Planned Parenthood, because in fact, that was sort of the number one promise of President Trump and Speaker Paul Ryan, who at the time said that was going to be the first legislation they took up. And so it was like people had to get on it. And I remember, women started organizing, people started organizing, and then of course we had the Women's March, which I know folks in Britain took part in as well as on every continent. The largest marches ever in our recorded history. And a lot of folks thought, well, day will happen, and people will knit their hats and they will protest, and then everyone will go home. And actually, I guess the way I'd say, Julia, is that it was actually just the opposite. In fact, after the march, everywhere women were saying, okay, what do we do now? We marched. They were going to town hall meetings with members of Congress to fight for Planned Parenthood, fight for the Affordable Care Act. And everywhere I went, women were stopping me saying, I just need to know what else I'm supposed to do. I think in the moment after Hillary Clinton's defeat, partly that was as if women thought, okay, maybe is there some way we could just roll back history and, pretend that didn't happen? And in fact, of course, what we had to do was start organizing. So I was leaving Planned Parenthood at the time, and I met up with a couple of other really amazing organizers, Alicia Garza, who was one of the co-founders of the global Black Lives Matter movement, and Ai-jen Poo, who is a national leader for domestic workers, caregivers in the US, of people who are obviously daycare workers taking care of the elderly, and 3 other women that we knew that were these feisty organizers. And we decided to create a new organization to try to channel this energy and also really kind of create a new political home for women who may not have been involved before. Because I think a lot of folks were saying, I never thought of myself as an activist, but something's got to change. And of course, as the Trump administration went on, whether it was our issues on immigration and family separation at the border, the Muslim ban, the repeal of LGBTQ rights, women's rights, voting rights, there were ample opportunities for folks to get involved. So we launched Supermajority last year in 2019 with a focus on creating training for women, creating community, because also, as you can imagine, for a lot of women in the US, they feel alone. They feel like, what can I do to make a difference? And then of course we became so we did a lot of that. We did bus tours through the US. We met with presidential candidates to talk about the issues that women cared about. And then this fall, we ran a massive voter engagement program, helping to not only register women to vote, particularly young women who hadn't voted before, women who hadn't maybe been part of the political process before, so that we could try to turn out the largest number of women ever in a presidential election. And well, we can talk more about what happened in this election, but women's role was definitive and determinative. We have a lot of work left to do, but we know that the need is out there to support women in their activism, and to ensure that as this new government comes in the United States, that we have a platform from which to advocate for changes and policies that actually address our issues.
Yeah, I mean, you started touching on this, but women, specifically Black women, turned out in record numbers, and were in many ways responsible for Biden's victory in this election. What do you think is the next step in ensuring they're empowered and continue to vote?
Well, first, I'm glad you said that, because I think it's so important to really, know what's happened, even though there's still a lot of, well, first, we also can't seem to move our president out of the White House yet, or he hasn't even accepted defeat, but I think that's going to come. But definitely Black women turned out at higher numbers. They overwhelmingly supported not only Joe Biden, but Kamala Harris, of course, our first woman ever elected to the executive branch, a Black woman, a woman of Indian American descent. I mean, it's historic for us. It's been a long, long time coming. Other women of color were progressive. White women, it's a mixed story. Although I will say that, I think a couple of interesting things are that, one, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won every age group of women, and historically that hasn't always been true. And a very big swing with young women in the US. I think a 10-point swing from the election in 2016 with young women. That's very encouraging, because the more young women we get involved as voters and activists, the better off we'll be. But to the point too is to me, the election was just it was like, we got to get the boot off our neck from the Trump administration, which has been, people have been fighting back against this administration on so many issues. And so we needed to win, but we all know that an election is just an opportunity. It's really just kind of kicking open the door. And now it's so important that organizations like Supermajority, like Planned Parenthood, like many of the other local women-led, women of color-led organizations coalesce and fight for the kinds of policy changes we need. I feel like, in a way, we convinced women collectively that voting mattered. And it was an historic turnout. I think 9 million more women voted than men in the US. But now we have to be able to show that that having someone else in office, having a new government, will matter. So I think it's really important that the grassroots stays involved. And also, look, President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris are inheriting a real disaster. As I'm sure you all know, you look at the maps, the US has done a terrible job in dealing with the COVID crisis. It's been so uneven. The federal government has really sort of just let go of responsibility. Everyone's hopeful for a vaccine. I know we were talking about the work that's happening there at Oxford, but we really haven't had a public health response that is consistent. And so I think it's important to recognize that whatever progress this administration makes is also going to rely on millions of folks in this country, including millions of women, that are going to be advocating and pushing from the grassroots as well. But the first order business, and I think where women are looking to see progress immediately, is dealing with the COVID crisis. Because, of course, for women in the US, it's not just a healthcare crisis, and it's a childcare crisis, it's a public school crisis, but it's also an economic crisis. The disproportionate impact of loss of employment is happening with women of color in particular. And a lot of women, as we're reading, are not going back to the workforce because they simply can't. They're taking care of their families, and it's impossible to, until we deal with the childcare crisis, for them to actually go back to the work that they had before.
There's a lot to unpack there, but maybe.
Yeah, I know, maybe that was too much, but
no, it's good.
Definitely on the minds of us all.
But maybe we can start with 2016. You also mentioned white women, and there was a big shift in electoral trends this year and from this year to 2016. I was wondering if you had any insight to what you think caused that shift, or why you think people weren't, or women specifically, weren't there for Hillary in a way that they were for Biden.
Oh, wow. I wish you're right. It's a very complicated topic, and I don't know all of the, none of us know everything, and there's a lot of work to be done now to unpack this. I do think that Donald Trump was an unknown quantity, and it's absolutely true that the longer Donald Trump was in office, the more women were determined to move him out. And so I do think look, this was an election that in many ways was defined by Donald Trump, by the people who adored him and the people who couldn't stand him. He is the most polarizing political figure. And his impact on the Republican Party is going to be felt for a long, long time. So I don't know that I don't know that it's easy to take this election because it was so much about Donald Trump. I do believe too that the pandemic has been such a crisis for women. They had to have a solution, and Joe Biden and Kamala Harris provided that solution. They have been saying from day one that we had to take this seriously, that we had to take healthcare seriously. They really addressed women's issues in a way that Donald Trump never has. And I just think that his complete inability to lead on this made women go out in droves. And again, there's still obviously a lot of people still voted for Donald Trump, including a lot of women. So there's a lot of work still to do to build the kind of progressive future I believe that we need and deserve in the US. But it's really hard to draw a lot of conclusions. Look, this was a high turnout election on both sides. It wasn't just that we and women and progressives got their votes out. Republicans and Donald Trump supporters came out to vote as well. And I think that's one of the things that was probably, there's so much now, morning after, kind of trying to figure out why the polls were so off. But I do think part of it is an underestimation of the power of turnout on the Republican and Trump voter side as well.
Yeah, and the Democrats have been handed a few losses, like you said, specifically when it comes to the Senate and the House. What do you think? What do you think that caused that? Because there seems to be a sort of mismatch between how people were voting in the presidential election versus how they were voting in the Senate or in the House?
Well, there weren't that many actually. I think with the exception of Maine and perhaps West Virginia, is there kind of a mismatch of in the terms of the statewide Senate races. So for example, Joe Biden won Maine, but Susan Collins, a Republican, won re-election. So I'm not sure that there was that much difference. I think one of the things though, some of the states, I'll just take my home state of Texas, where there were high hopes for picking up more congressional seats because of what it looked like were trends. And I do believe those are trends that are real and are going to continue, particularly in the suburban areas of Texas. These are districts that were drawn for Republican Congress people. They are ones where you had to really outperform in a big way to flip these seats until there are new lines drawn. And so I do think that we did have higher turnout. We did have real support from suburban women in particular for Democratic candidates in a lot of congressional races, but we also had higher turnout by Republicans. And so I just think it undercut the advantage that some pollsters imagined that we had. Look, I mean, our country is very divided in a partisan way. And so, I mean, when you look at how many millions more votes Joe Biden got than Donald Trump, this was a pretty overwhelming win for him, even though you wouldn't know that based on the president's protestations that everything was unfair and rigged against him. This was a very decisive election. I do think some of these states where the districts are so lopsided, it's just going to take a lot more. It would take, frankly, nonpartisan redistricting in order to make huge progress on the congressional side. That may be too in the weeds for this conversation. I don't know, but anyway, happy to talk about it more.
This is good. No, but you mentioned Texas, and you've done a lot of work in Texas, campaigning for Democratic candidates, including your mother, having founded the Texas Freedom Network, etc. Like you said, there was lots of excitement with Texas and it turning blue, but it didn't. So what do you think was the cause? Do you think it is, do you think it's down to turnout, or do you think it's something else?
So, I mean, I think it was all, people did love to talk about Texas turning blue. That was definitely a sort of a, for anyone who's been working there for their whole life, it's like always something we, think about, talk about, hope for. We did better. I mean, we just keep doing better every year. So it's like, we're not going backwards. But look, I think that pollsters in the state that were more optimistic underestimated the Republican turnout. And that's just something to factor in, but it is a state that is changing. I mean, it's really phenomenal. Again, I was born in Texas, grew up there, still, my whole family's still there. The cities in Texas are now reliably Democratic and by overwhelming margins. Increasingly, the suburban areas are trending Democratic. And of course, the state is now majority people of color state, so the demographics are changing in the state. And for the first time, I mean, it was for many years, it wasn't a red state or blue state, just a non-voting state, as one of our political pollsters in Houston says. But this year there was historic turnout. And I do think that there's a lot to take from that. If we can engage more voters in Texas, I think it's only a matter of time. And unfortunately, I mean, I know 2020 didn't bear all, have all the results that some of us hope for, but it's really interesting. If you look at Texas, in some ways I'm a little bit of a microcosm of the US. In 2018, the midterm elections, which were so defining, where women were just out in droves, we elected historic numbers of women, the first two Latinas ever from the state of Texas to go to Congress, Sylvia Garcia and Veronica Escobar. We elected a 20-something county judge, Latina county judge in Harris County, which is the third largest county in the country, completely unexpected. And so I feel like, like every bit of progress, there's a little, you roll a little bit forward and then you take a couple of steps back. but I just think it's a matter of time. And I really do want to say, for any of you ever like study Texas, or the leadership by young people, and particularly young women of color in Texas, is phenomenal. They are leading every important organization, grassroots organization. So when it does turn, I think it's important to know that it's not just a matter of chance or demographics. It's a matter of actually a ton of hard work by people who've been committed to this for decades.
You mentioned demographics changing, and Texas is becoming a lot more Latinx specifically. But in Texas, those communities tended to vote. Well, they voted for Trump in a larger proportion than they did in 2016. In Texas specifically, why do you think that's the case? Because obviously it changes quite a lot state to state when it comes to the Latinx community.
Right. I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to just make up my own ideas, but I do think that it's really important to recognize that the Latinx community in the US is incredibly diverse. It's just like in the same way you can't really just talk about any one group that's that big. And I think that sometimes the political systems and political communicators don't, they're behind a little bit. And I think this is an area where, the Latinx community in the Rio Grande border in Texas bears very little resemblance to the Latinx community in Miami, or, and on and on and on. In fact, Paulo Ramos just wrote a great book here, has been reporting on the Latinx community, and it really, to me, underscores the incredible diversity. And so I do think this is one of these important areas where understanding what people care about, what their issues are, their concerns, what they want from government is really important. And you cannot simply paint everybody with the same brush. And I think there's been a lack of investment in general politically with women of color, people of color. And I hope that some of the learning out of all this is that people need to pay attention, and not just around election time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work you did, especially early on in your career, was with unions and doing some of the things that you were mentioning. Women are doing in Texas now. So I was wondering, how have those experiences informed the way you lead today?
So I was a union organizer for like all my early days, and I mean, I worked with like hotel workers in New Orleans and nursing home workers in East Texas and all over. I mean, mainly women that were earning minimum wage, and mainly women of color. And I felt, I mean, I learned so much from them. There was still women, Georgia Landry, a nursing home worker in Beaumont, Texas, I still feel I can hear her voice in my ear. These are women who had so little and yet were willing to risk everything to try to create a union, try to make something better, if not for themselves. And many of them were at the end of their career. They just wanted to make it better for the next generation. And what I learned so much from being a union organizer is the importance of listening to people. I think there's a sort of mystique that somehow to be a great leader, and I think politicians suffer this, is that they just have to have great ideas and just be charismatic and all that. And I actually think and this is what I have felt the last 2 years working with Supermajority, is that women, and particularly women of color, in this country feel like unheard, unseen, uncared for. And I do think, after the last election in 2016, I remember so many folks were saying, well, why are women voting against their own self-interest? Which is sort of a phrase that people like to throw around. And I really believe that you can't assume you understand what someone's real interests and needs are. And I feel like we've just begun to scratch the surface of that at Supermajority, really engaging women who are not politically active, who are not, don't feel like they know all the things that they need to know to be an effective advocate for themselves or their communities or their families. And so to me, the most important thing we can do right now is start listening to people, and particularly people who have been underrepresented. It sounds like very obvious, but we don't do it very well. And one of the most exciting things, despite the misery of the last 4 years of this administration, I'll just say that like unabashedly, so many people were hurt, families separated. I mean, we could go down the list, but one of the most exciting things has been in the US is to see the explosion of young people, young women of color, not waiting to be asked to run for office, not, waiting their turn. And if there one thing I would take out of, these last 4 years, it is that we are now, we have a long way to go in terms of representation, but it's a given that that's where we're headed. And unfortunately, we took a lot of steps back with the Trump administration that promoted almost no women, almost no people of color, really remade the federal judiciary to be a much more white and male branch of government. But I look at the young women who are going to Congress, not only the famous ones, but some who are just really setting the world on fire, and they have big expectations, and we better listen to them because they are the future, and that's what we should be investing in.
Well, in your book, Make Trouble, you outline your congressional testimony in 2015. And you write, and I found this quite interesting, it was clear from the get-go that this hearing was all for the television cameras. There wasn't going to be any fact-finding. So it was, in a way, sort of a pre-Trump fake news commentary.
Yeah.
Well, maybe you can talk a little bit about that specifically, but I was also wondering how you combat misinformation personally as a leader.
Right. No, you're right. It was kind of it was a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, like just, oh my gosh, what are we dealing with? I know, I did go before Congress to defend Planned Parenthood, and this was one of the many efforts by Republican leadership to defund us, and extremely hostile group of mainly men, almost 100% men, who wanted to critique everything about me, my qualifications, my salary, you name it. And I mean, it was embarrassing in many ways, the lack of interest in anything that I would be telling them about what it was a really important topic, which is, are you going to cut off funding for healthcare for like a couple of million folks in this country? But yes, it was clear, and from the moment, it started, the cameras were rolling and there was, flash bulbs are going off, and it was clear this was a TV show. This was not a congressional hearing. It was so bad in the middle of the hearing, because it went on for a few hours. I looked at my phone and my son had texted me. He said, "Mom, I'm so proud of you. I think raising me all those years really helped you prepare for this hearing," which was kind of, that kind of captures what it was like. But one of the things I guess I learned, and then I'll answer your other question. One of the things I learned is that actually in the middle of it, I realized all they really wanted is for me to get into a fight with them. Because every time I wouldn't take the bait and instead tried to just calmly answer their question, it almost they got more agitated and, big vein popping moments. And I think that was part of what I realized, that this was actually, they wanted to get into a fight. I wanted to talk about what was happening with healthcare for women. And the more I wouldn't do that, the angrier they got and the worse they looked on television. And I feel like in some ways that is one of the lessons is if someone is making an idiot of themselves on TV, sometimes you should just let them keep the microphone and keep going. It was an important, but it was an important moment. And for me, it was also important. I was representing not me and not only Planned Parenthood, I was representing millions of folks who were counting on us to be there for them for healthcare. So I think that's, anyway, every woman's been, I'm sure if you haven't yet, you will be, everyone's sort of been in that room before. And so I think it's important that we support each other, and just realize, we don't have to stoop to whatever the behavior is of, the folks that we're dealing with. But you asked a second question, which I'm trying to remember what it was.
No,
end
just
question.
combating misinformation. How do you personally?
Oh, right. Because, well, actually, it was kind of funny in that hearing. Again, I don't know if funny is the right word, but actually the chairman of the committee brings up this big chart that he claims was a Planned Parenthood chart about how, I don't even remember what he was, but it was obviously something he had completely made up. And as Rachel Maddow, one of my favorite commentators in the US, said, it didn't even have a y-axis. It was just like these bars going. And then I looked and read that it was actually it said at the bottom, created by, and it was by one of the national anti-abortion groups. So it was the original fake news. So we were able to call that out in the hearing. So that kind of helped us get off to a better start. But I do think one of the things we're doing at Supermajority is helping women be trusted sources of information to other women. I mean, we have to call out the technology, social media folks, because their allowance for misinformation, including right now, this moment about this election in the US, is horrifying. But in addition, we have to women trust other women. And I do think it's important that we provide them the tools and the support to be able to combat this. I saw it in the election, some of the rumors and misinformation about Joe Biden that I'm not even going to repeat because it's just, again, giving airtime. But we heard from women, members of Supermajority, literally talking to other women and being able to give them real facts when sometimes those facts are really absent. So it's a huge problem in the US. It's a huge problem for our democracy. And we've got to use every tool we can to try to get honest and true information to people, and then they can make good decisions.
Yeah. Well, we have to move on to audience questions. Everyone, please keep submitting your questions using the question and answer function, and remember to include your name and college. So first, we've got from Claire. She says, there are various moments you've been sitting across the table from men who belittle, mansplain, and refuse to listen to you. An experience I think many women have had. But you have a remarkable way of staying composed. What goes through your mind in those moments?
Well, thank you, Claire. One is that there are folks counting on you to not, as I said, like earlier, I think not take the bait, not get down in the mud, and actually really stand up for the principles that you believe in. But I also think, Claire, one of the things I have been thinking about a lot more, because a lot of young people, actually, college students, will say to me, okay, what can I do? And it's not just what you do. Obviously, you should stand up for the things you believe in. You should call out behavior when it's wrong. But we also have to stand up for each other. And that includes men. And that includes men standing up for women. I talk sometimes on college campuses, and I've encouraged young men to say, if something's happening and you see what's happening, you see that someone's being belittled, that the treatment they're having is racist, it's sexist, it's whatever it is, it's homophobic. Don't just count on the person who's actually on the hot seat there, but stand up for them. You know how big a difference that would make, whether it's in a meeting, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's in a public forum. And I think that's something that we underestimate. We just expect that each of us somehow has to be this heroic figure, being able to take it all. And really what we have to do is have each other's back. And that, to me, that's something that's happening in the US that I feel like has never happened before. And in fact, for women, it's like women taking joy in the success of other women instead of feeling like there's only one of everybody. I love what Kamala Harris says, which is, it's okay to be the first, but you better not be the last. And so partly that is, when you can, keep your cool, be the person. And also when you see someone else doing it, stand up for them, because it's a lot easier if we actually do this together.
So David wants to know whether or not you'd consider shifting to politics. I think he means running.
Oh, thank you, David. Running for office. I know, because I feel like my daily drip is politics. I don't know. Never say never. And I say that now because I used to always say, like, I would never run for office. And then I see all these women who are just going, I don't know, I guess I'll run for office. So I think it's important to walk the walk too and say, I don't know, maybe someday. I'll also say that I'm an organizer. I mean, I worked for Speaker Pelosi for a while, who is remarkable. And I was like, I was probably the job I was like the least good at of anything I've ever done. And so sometimes too, I feel like there's a lot of ways to change the world. And if you're lucky enough to be able to choose what you do for a living and choose something that like makes your heart sing, I hope you'll do it. For me, it's been organizing. So I don't know, maybe something happens, but if it doesn't, that's okay. I love nothing more. And this last year, I have enjoyed so much doing fundraisers. I was like, for women that were running for office, going and working for Stacey Abrams when she was running for governor of Georgia. And I hope to get to do that again. So partly it is kind of back to what I was saying, is like taking the joy and the success of other folks, women and people of color who are finally getting their chance to serve. That feels pretty good too.
So Juliet wants to know what you do to organize, what the steps you take to organize are.
So Juliet, I mean, I think it's funny, we talk about this now, like, is it like a dying art or whatever, but it's kind of a simple idea. I think that the idea of organizing is just finding folks who have common concerns or common goals or common purpose and pulling them together. And I've done it at the very local, level when we, wanted to change a policy on the school board, or even at a school, which can be a great first organizing effort. I'm sure things that you all do there at Oxford, or it can be actually grouping up with other folks around your community or country. I just think that it's, to me, organizing works if you have a passion for something you want to see changed. So for me, it has been about the empowerment of women and women of color finally having sort of the economic equity and opportunity that everyone else has had, or that certainly that white men have had. And that can be, again, it can be saying, well, let's get more representative government. Again, I think that's something that happens, that can happen in high school, that can happen at university, that can happen beyond that. But it can also happen in a lot of other ways, choosing an issue that you care about. Right now, I'm really passionate about the lack of affordable childcare in our country. And that's not, that's the kind of the thing that women right now are all having to figure out on their own. So why don't we do this as a nation? Why don't we actually say it's a value? And I think it's exciting to think about organizing millions of people, not just women, to make that an option. But I do think the important thing is, if you've got an idea, if you've got something that you care about, start talking to people about it. And then you'll actually, it's kind of the way you figure out if your idea has merit. Because if it does, other folks are going to say, I've been wondering why no one did anything about that. I remember the famous comedian Lily Tomlin said once, I used to say, why doesn't somebody do something about that? And I realized one day, maybe that somebody is me. And I think that's really kind of all organizing is about. And if you decide you want to organize something, let me know. I love nothing more than giving tips and encouragement to folks who want to change the world.
Just one last question, and from me, but it's a follow-up to what you just said. What do you think the role of technology is in that? Do you think everything has changed with the internet?
I mean, it's interesting. Of course it's changed because we can do things faster, but both for good and bad. As you were talking about misinformation earlier, Julia, it's sort of like you can get people organized more quickly. And also, like, if you have a big Twitter account, you can lie about things like an election, and it can have immediate uptake and influence public debate in a way that can be potentially really harmful. So it's here to stay. It's not like whether it's good or bad because it's going to be here. I think it's the way we think about using it. I know as an organizer, I mean, I am the original like grassroots organizer. There is nothing I love more than going to a coffee shop and sitting around with 25 people and talking about how we're going to make change. Clearly that during COVID, we had to completely flip the script here at Supermajority, and everything became virtual. And we learned how to run virtual phone banks, like having women on Zoom from all over the country phoning into the state of Michigan to help make sure women could get to vote. And I think there's power in that. And I think the really smart social, media organizers and digi organizers are finding ways to incorporate joy and fun and music and culture in organizing through virtual means. So I think it's going to always be a part of it. And I honestly feel like we had to fast forward our skills in the US because this election was coming, whether we could ever get back on the ground or not. And a large part of this election was done online. So I think it's huge opportunity for engagement. I think it's also a way, in many ways, for people who haven't had their voices in the mix. Again, not to just be a broken record, but really young people, people of color. Social media is providing a way to find each other, give voice to folks who didn't have a platform before, and that to me is exciting. And it's the future. I mean, it's gotten so much that I actually think I'm going to figure out how to use TikTok. So that's where I'm going to leave it, I think.
You feel, this has given me a lot of hope, and I really have enjoyed this. I hope you have too.
Yes, it's so great to visit with you and everybody, and good luck to you. Go make trouble. That's the most important thing.
Thank you.